The vibration on my nightstand dragged me out of sleep at 2:52 a.m. It wasn't the soft buzz of a text or a missed call. This was sharper, more insistent, like something that refused to be ignored. For a second, I lay there, eyes half closed, trying to decide if it could wait until morning. Then it buzzed again. I reached for my phone, the screen lighting up the dark bedroom in a pale blue glow. The notification wasn't from anything I recognized. Unusual activity alert. Please review immediately. My chest tightened before I even unlocked the screen. I opened my banking app out of habit, expecting something small, a flagged charge, maybe a subscription renewal I'd forgotten about. Instead, I saw a number I didn't understand. $0. I blinked, thinking the screen hadn't loaded properly. I refreshed it once, twice, still zero. The room suddenly felt too quiet. I sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around my shoulders as I scrolled down to the transaction history. My fingers started to shake before I even reached the first line. There were transfers, dozens of them, all within minutes. The timestamps stacked on top of each other: 2:11 a.m., 2:12, 2:14, each one moving chunks of money out of the account like someone methodically draining a tank. My breath caught. No, that's not possible. I tapped into one of the transfers, my eyes scanning for anything that would make this make sense. The system confirmed it had been authorized through my device, my phone. My stomach dropped. I was asleep. I turned my head toward the other side of the bed, empty. The pillow beside me was cold. For a moment I just stared at it, my mind trying and failing to connect what I was seeing on my screen with what I knew about my life. My name is Claire Benton. I'm 33 and I teach English at a public high school here in Portland, Maine. My life isn't complicated. It isn't dramatic. It's routines and lesson plans and grocery lists and remembering to call my mother on Sundays. And my husband, Daniel Mercer, was supposed to be part of that quiet, predictable life. But Daniel wasn't home. I checked the time again. Nearly 3 in the morning. He'd mentioned a trip the night before, something about an early flight, a last-minute client situation. I hadn't questioned it. I hadn't questioned him. My hand tightened around the phone. I scrolled further down the transaction list, my heart pounding louder with every line. The transfers didn't just go to one place. They moved through several accounts like someone knew exactly how to break the trail apart. And then I saw it. A name attached to the final destination, a company I didn't recognize, and beneath that a label I hadn't paid attention to before. Account type, estate reserve. The words didn't register at first. Then they hit all at once. This wasn't just my money. The air left my lungs in a slow, hollow rush. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up the hardwood floor, cold under my feet as I tried to steady myself. The estate reserve account wasn't something I casually checked or talked about. It wasn't part of our everyday finances. It was something separate, something I had been entrusted with, something Daniel was never supposed to touch. My phone buzzed again in my hand, making me flinch. A new notification. Banking verification required, pending review on restricted estate transaction. I stared at the message, my pulse echoing in my ears. Somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, while I was asleep in my own bed, my husband had emptied an account he didn't understand. And whatever he thought he'd taken wasn't his. I didn't sleep again after that. By the time the sky over Portland started to pale into that dull gray blue of early morning, I was still sitting at the edge of the bed, my phone in my hand, staring at numbers that refused to change. The house was quiet in that way it only is before the world wakes up. No traffic, no voices, just the low hum of the heater and the occasional creak of old wood settling. I kept going back to the same thought. Daniel had my phone, not just access to the account, my phone. The memory surfaced slowly, like something I hadn't wanted to look at too closely. The night before, I'd been exhausted. It had been a long week at school, final papers, grading parent emails that never seemed to end. I remembered sitting on the couch, half watching the news, my phone in my lap. Daniel had walked in later than usual. He'd looked off, not angry, not upset, just focused in a way I hadn't seen in a while. "You should go to bed," he'd said, almost gently. You look wiped out. I'd laughed it off at first. I'll finish this episode. But he'd already reached for my phone. I'll set your alarm, he added. You said you had that early meeting. It hadn't felt strange then. Not really. We'd been married 10 years. There were no locked screens between us, no hidden passwords. Or at least that's what I'd believed. I remembered handing it over without thinking. I remembered going upstairs, brushing my teeth, crawling into bed. And that was it. That was all it took. My grip tightened around the phone now, my knuckles pale against the dim morning light. Somewhere between that moment and 2:11 a.m., everything had changed. I stood up and walked slowly into the kitchen, the cold tile grounding me in a way the bedroom couldn't. The coffee maker sat untouched on the counter. Usually by this time, Daniel would have already started a pot. He liked things routine, predictable. Except, apparently, when he didn't. I leaned against the counter, closing my eyes for a second. The account, the estate reserve, that wasn't something I talked about. Not in detail, not even with him. After my Aunt Edith passed last fall, I'd been named the personal representative of her estate. It wasn't a title I'd asked for, but I'd accepted it because someone had to, and because I was the one person in the family who still lived close enough to handle things. The house had sold quicker than anyone expected, and the proceeds had gone into that account. Not my account, not Daniel's, an estate account, temporary, structured, monitored. It wasn't money to spend, it was money to distribute. I opened my eyes and looked down at the phone again as if the screen might suddenly correct itself. Daniel knew about the estate. Of course he did. He'd asked questions at first, normal ones: how much the house sold for, how long it would take before everything was settled, whether there would be anything left over. At the time, I'd answered carefully, the way my attorney had advised. It's not mine, I'd told him more than once. It's held until everything's cleared. He'd nodded, dropped it. Or at least that's what I thought. Lately, though, the questions had come back. More specific, more frequent. How long does it just sit there? Who actually checks it? Is it all in one place? I'd brushed them off, explained what I could without getting into legal details. I never imagined he was asking because he was trying to figure out how to access it. A hollow feeling settled in my chest. I moved to the kitchen table and sat down, the phone still in my hand like it was the only solid thing in the room. There had been other things too. Late nights, more client meetings than usual, a new kind of distance, not loud, not obvious, but steady. I'd told myself it was stress, work pressure. Everyone goes through phases like that. You don't jump to conclusions after 10 years of marriage. You don't assume the person you built a life with is quietly calculating something behind your back. But now, sitting there in the early light of a Thursday morning with an empty account and a missing husband, all of those small moments felt different. Not random, not harmless, connected. My phone screen dimmed, then brightened again as I tapped it, pulling the account page back up. The label stared back at me. Estate Reserve. Daniel hadn't just taken money, he had taken responsibility, legal liability, trust, things that didn't disappear just because the balance did. Outside, a car passed tires hissing on damp pavement. The world was starting to move again, but I stayed where I was, trying to hold on to one simple truth. This wasn't a mistake, and whatever Daniel thought he'd found in that account, he hadn't understood it. The call came just after 8. I was still sitting at the kitchen table, the coffee I'd poured sitting untouched in front of me, already gone cold. The early morning light had fully settled in, now turning everything sharp and ordinary again, like the world expected me to keep moving. My phone rang, and when I saw the name, my stomach tightened. Martin Halpern. I didn't let it ring twice. Claire, he said the moment I answered. His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, something measured. I assume you've seen the activity on the estate account. I swallowed. Yes. A pause. Not long, just enough to let the weight of that statement settle. Then I need you to listen carefully, he continued. That account is under probate oversight. It's not a standard personal account. Any unauthorized movement, especially at this scale, triggers automatic review. My fingers curled around the edge of the table. I didn't authorize anything I said. My voice lower than I expected. I was asleep. I understand, he replied. And I'm not suggesting otherwise, but from the system's perspective, the transactions were authenticated through your registered device. My phone. I closed my eyes for a second. What happens now? I asked. There will be a formal inquiry, Martin said. The bank will flag the transfers, and the court can step in if necessary. But more importantly, Claire, he paused again, choosing his words carefully. That money doesn't belong to you. You know that. I know. It belongs to the estate, to multiple beneficiaries, some of whom are already expecting distributions in the coming months. The words landed heavier than anything else he'd said so far. Not just money, people. I need you to pull the transaction records immediately, he continued. Every detail, timing, destinations, amounts, we're going to need a full accounting. I already started, I said quietly. Glancing at the phone in my hand, the screen was still open to the transaction history. Good, he said. And Claire, until we understand exactly what happened, you need to be very careful about what you say to anyone, including family. My chest tightened at that. Family. They'll find out, I said. Yes, he replied, but how they find out matters. The call ended a minute later, but I didn't move right away. I just sat there, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the silence on the other end. Then I slowly lowered it and looked back down at the screen. The same list of transfers, the same empty balance, but now it felt different. He'd said it plainly. This wasn't my money, which meant this wasn't just my loss. I took a slow breath and tapped into the first transfer again, forcing myself to look more closely this time. There were details I hadn't paid attention to before: routing numbers, processing notes, a sequence of intermediate accounts. The money hadn't gone straight from point A to point B. It had moved split, redirected, layered, deliberately. My pulse picked up again. This wasn't someone panicking. This was someone planning. I scrolled further down, toward the final transactions. The last destination appeared again, the same unfamiliar name. A business entity. I stared at it longer this time, trying to make it mean something. It didn't. But below it, in smaller text, was something else. A note attached to one of the transfers. Reservation payment, Coastal Ridge Resort. The words felt out of place, too casual, too normal. A resort. I leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking under the sudden shift in my weight. Daniel had mentioned a trip, an early flight, a client. My grip tightened around the phone. I opened the next transaction, another payment, Harbor Line Marina Services, then another, a deposit tied to something that looked like a corporate registration fee. My thoughts started to move faster, but not clearer. I wasn't putting pieces together yet. I was just seeing them, one by one, and every piece pointed in the same direction, away from me, and towards something I hadn't been part of. Outside, the sound of a car door slamming echoed faintly down the street. Someone starting their day, heading to work, living a life that still made sense. I stayed where I was, because for the first time since the alert woke me up, I understood something that wouldn't go away. This wasn't an accident, and whoever had done this had known exactly what they were taking. The email came at 10:17 a.m. I was still at the kitchen table, surrounded by printouts I hadn't meant to make, but suddenly couldn't stop making: transaction logs, account summaries, timestamps, anything that felt solid enough to hold in my hands. My laptop chimed softly, and I glanced at the screen, expecting something from the bank. It was from a law office in Portland. The subject line was short and almost offensively polite. Notice of intent to file for legal separation. For a second, I thought I was reading it wrong. Then I opened it. The message was brief. Daniel had retained counsel. He was seeking a formal separation and requesting immediate documentation related to what his attorney described as marital funds concealed outside the ordinary household disclosure process. I read that sentence 3 times. Concealed. Marital funds. As if I had hidden something. As if the money from Aunt Edith's estate had ever belonged to either of us in the first place. I sat very still. my hands flat on the table, feeling the kind of cold that starts somewhere below your ribs. Daniel hadn't just taken the money, he was moving ahead with a story, and in his version of it, I was the one who had done something wrong. My phone rang before I could even finish reading the attachment. It was my cousin Marlene Aunt Edith's oldest niece. She lived in Scarborough, had just turned 68, and had been calling every few weeks since the house sold, not to pressure me, but because she was helping cover her husband's medications and needed to know when the estate would finally close. Claire, she said, and I heard it immediately in her voice. Worry, shame, hesitation. I wasn't going to call, but my sister just told me there's some kind of issue with Edith's money. I closed my eyes. Who told her that? There was a pause. Someone from Daniel's family, I think. I don't know. It was all very vague. Something about the account being frozen. The account wasn't frozen. Not yet. Under review, yes, but not frozen, which meant Daniel or someone speaking for him had already started shaping the rumor before I could even catch my breath. Marlene, I said carefully, there was unauthorized activity on the estate account overnight. I'm working with the attorney now. I don't have the full picture yet, but I need you to hear this from me. I did not move that money. She exhaled, and I could hear the relief in it. Not complete relief, just enough to keep panic from taking over. I believe you, she said quietly. I needed to ask. After we hung up, I stared at the wall for a long time. That was the part that hurt in a new way. Not that people were worried. They had every right to be. It was that Daniel understood exactly where the pressure points were. He knew the account involved older relatives. He knew timing mattered. He knew if doubt reached them first, I'd spend precious time defending myself instead of tracing what he'd done. My inbox chimed again. Another email from his attorney. This one included a draft filing. I opened the PDF and felt my face go hot. It described me as financially secretive, suggested I had failed to disclose substantial liquid assets, claimed Daniel had only recently become aware of funds maintained outside the marital structure. The wording was careful, professional, clean, but the implication was filthier than anything he could have said out loud. My marriage was ending in a legal document that used his theft as evidence against me. I pushed back from the table so fast the chair scraped hard against the floor. I wanted to call him. I wanted to hear his voice and ask what kind of man emptied an estate account in the middle of the night and then hired a lawyer before breakfast. But I didn't. Martin Halpern's words came back to me. Be careful about what you say, including family. So I stayed where I was. My phone sat beside the stack of papers. The estate reserve account glowed from the screen like an accusation or a warning. Then a new email came in from Daniel's attorney, just one line above the attachment. Please preserve all records relating to the account in question. I stared at it, pulse rising again. He wasn't waiting to see what happened. He was building a case. And for the first time that morning, I understood something worse than what he'd already taken. He intended to leave me holding the damage. By early afternoon, the numbers had started to turn into a pattern. Not a good one, not a comforting one, but a pattern all the same. I was sitting in a small office at the downtown branch of Casco Bay Community Bank, across from a woman named Elena Lopez, the bank's fraud investigator, while she moved through the transaction trail with the kind of calm that only comes from seeing people at their worst on a regular basis. She didn't waste words. These weren't random transfers, she said, turning her monitor slightly so I could see it. Whoever did this knew how to move money fast enough to create delay, but not enough to make it disappear. I stared at the screen. The outgoing transfers were stacked in neat rows, each one time-stamped within minutes of the next. What looked like chaos from my phone at 3 a.m. now looked almost methodical. Elena clicked into the device record. The login came from your registered phone, yes. But the session began while the phone was connected to your home Wi-Fi. That helps? Helps me, I said quietly, or helps him? She looked at me, then really looked at me, and I realized she had already guessed more than I'd said out loud. It helps establish location, she replied. After that, the money was routed through 3 receiving points before it landed in an LLC account. Newly created. Very little history. My throat tightened. Can you see the name? She could. I watched her read it once, then angle the screen toward me. Mercer Coastal Holdings, LLC. For a second, I honestly thought I might be sick. Mercer. He hadn't even tried to hide himself completely. He'd just hidden himself well enough to buy time. Elena kept going, her tone even. There's more. The first debit from that LLC this morning went to a resort property in South Carolina. Coastal Ridge Resort, 2 guests, 5-night stay, South Carolina, Daniel's trip. My fingers curled around the arm of the chair until I could feel the wood pressing into my palm. And the second I asked, she clicked again. Harbor Line Marina Services. Deposit received at 8:06 a.m. A marina. Of course it was a marina. That was the moment something changed in me, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a way I felt with perfect clarity. Until then, some part of me had still been reaching for an explanation that would let me survive this with my old life intact. A bad choice, a desperate mistake, a man who panicked and crossed a line he didn't understand. But Resort Bookings Marina deposits an LLC with his name on it and a legal separation notice sent before lunch. That wasn't panic. That was planning. Elena printed the transaction summary and slid it across the desk. You need to preserve everything, she said, not just for the bank, for the estate review, for the court if it gets there. If it gets there. It already had. When I stepped outside, the air off the harbor was damp and cold, and for a moment I just stood on the sidewalk with the folder pressed against my chest like it might hold me together. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. Landed. Busy the rest of the day. We'll talk tonight. I looked at those words for a long time. Landed, busy, we'll talk tonight, as if the day hadn't already split my life clean in two. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened the folder Elena had given me and looked again at the name of the LLC, the resort charged, the marina deposit. Then I thought about Marlene, about her husband's medication, about Aunt Edith trusting me because I was the steady one, about the draft separation filing that painted me as deceptive while Daniel spent estate money by the ocean. The truth settled in hard and final. If I stayed quiet now, I wouldn't be protecting my marriage. I'd be helping him bury what he'd done. I stood there on the sidewalk in downtown Portland, cars moving past people carrying coffee. The whole city going on as if this were an ordinary Thursday, and maybe that was what made the decision feel so clean. I was done confusing silence with loyalty. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove back toward the waterfront and sat in my car for a long time, the folder from the bank resting on the passenger seat like something alive. The harbor was gray, the water moving in slow, steady lines that didn't care about anything I was going through. My phone buzzed again. Daniel. I stared at his name for a few seconds before answering. Hey, he said like it was any other day, like we were any other couple. You get my text, I did. A pause, then a softer tone. I've got back-to-back meetings here. Charleston's a mess this time of year. Can we talk tonight? I looked out at the water at the boats rocking gently in their slips. You're not in meetings, I said. Silence. Not long. Just long enough. Claire. You're at a resort, I continued, my voice steady. Coastal Ridge. 2 guests, 5 nights. You paid this morning. Out of an LLC you opened 3 weeks ago. The line went completely still. I could almost hear him recalculating. You went through my accounts, he asked finally. The question was so clean, so controlled, it almost made me laugh. You emptied an estate account in the middle of the night, I said. You don't get to ask me that. Another pause, then a shift. Okay, he said, exhaling slowly, let's just slow this down. You're upset, I get that, but you're misunderstanding what that account is. I closed my eyes for a moment. There it was, not denial. Reframing, that account is tied to you, he continued. Your name's on it. It's not like I broke into some stranger's safe, Claire. It's part of our financial picture, whether you want to admit that or not. No, I said quietly. It isn't. You've been holding on to that money for months, he pressed, not touching it, not using it. While we've been budgeting, cutting back, you don't see how that looks. I felt something tighten in my chest, not doubt, not confusion, just clarity. It's not ours, I said again. You knew that. I knew what you told me, he shot back, which, by the way, hasn't exactly been transparent. There it was. The narrative he'd already started building in paperwork was now in his voice. I didn't steal anything, he said. I moved funds, legally accessible funds. There's a difference. I opened my eyes and looked at the water again. Daniel, I said that account is under probate oversight. There are beneficiaries, people waiting on that money. They'll get paid, he replied quickly. It's temporary. I just needed to move things around, short term, for what I asked. Another pause, then more carefully, to fix things. Fix things? A resort, a marina deposit, a shell company. I let the silence sit between us. Did you already talk to a lawyer? I asked. He didn't answer right away. Claire. That's a yes. I needed to protect myself, he said, and now there was something sharper under the calm. Because from where I'm standing, you've been sitting on a significant asset and pretending it doesn't exist in our marriage. I almost missed it. Almost. But it was there. He wasn't scared of what he'd done. He was preparing to justify it. I'm not going to argue with you about this over the phone, I said. That's probably smart, he replied, relief creeping back into his voice. We can sort this out like adults tonight. No need to drag anyone else into it. Anyone else. The bank, the attorney, the beneficiaries, the court. I looked down at the folder again, the printed transactions, the LLC, the timestamps, the pieces that didn't disappear just because he wanted them to. Daniel, I said, I've already reported the transactions. The silence this time was heavier. What does that mean? He asked. It means the bank flagged it, I said, and the estate attorney is involved. His breath caught just slightly. You didn't have to do that, he said. And now the calm was thinner. We could have handled this privately. No, I said. We couldn't. Another long pause. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, not louder, not angry, just colder. You're making this bigger than it needs to be. I tightened my grip on the phone. No, I said again. You already did that. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Then he exhaled slow and controlled. Fine, he said. We'll deal with it tonight. The line went dead. I lowered the phone and stared straight ahead. For a long time, I'd thought the hardest part would be finding out the truth. It wasn't. The hardest part was accepting that the truth didn't come with an apology. It came with a plan. And now, for the first time since the night started, I had one too. Friday morning came too fast. I barely remembered going to bed, only that I had sat at the kitchen table long after dark, the folder open in front of me, rereading the same pages until the words blurred together. At some point, exhaustion had pulled me under. Now I was standing outside the Cumberland County Probate Court building, the cold air sharper than it had been the day before, the weight of the folder heavier in my hands. This wasn't just about me anymore. It hadn't been for a while. Inside the conference room was already half full. I recognized a few faces immediately. Marlene seated near the end of the table, her posture stiff, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Next to her sat her younger sister Diane, who avoided my eyes at first before offering a small, uncertain nod. These were people I had known my whole life, people who trusted me, or had. At the front of the room, Martin Halpern stood near a stack of documents, speaking quietly with another man I hadn't met yet. Late 50s, gray suit, careful expression. Bank representative, I assumed. I took a seat across from them, placing the folder down in front of me like an anchor. The door opened again, and Daniel walked in. He looked exactly the same. That was the strangest part. Pressed shirt, confident stride, the same composed expression he wore in every professional setting, as if nothing in the world had shifted under his feet. He glanced at me briefly, then looked away, taking a seat near the far side of the table. Not beside me, across from me. That felt deliberate. Thank you all for coming on short notice, Martin said, stepping forward once everyone had settled. As you've likely heard, there has been unauthorized activity on the Benton Estate Reserve account. Today's purpose is to clarify what we know so far and outline next steps. There was a murmur around the table, low controlled, people trying to process without reacting too quickly. Martin nodded toward the bank representative. Ms. Carter from Casco Bay Community Bank will walk us through the transaction findings. The woman in the gray suit stepped forward, placing a thin stack of papers in front of each of us. I didn't need to look down. I already knew what was in it. The transactions in question occurred between 2:11 and 2:17 a.m. on Thursday, she began. All were authenticated through the registered device associated with Ms. Benton. However, she paused just long enough for the room to lean in. The session originated from a fixed residential IP address tied to Ms. Benton's home network. Following that, funds were routed through multiple intermediary accounts before being deposited into a newly formed limited liability company. I could feel eyes shifting, not just toward me, toward him. Daniel didn't move. "Can you name the company?" Marlene asked, her voice tight but steady. The bank representative didn't hesitate. "Mercer Coastal Holdings, LLC. The silence that followed was different from the earlier murmurs, heavier, more focused. I looked at Daniel. For the first time since he walked in, something in his posture changed. Not dramatically, but enough. A tightening, a slight shift in his shoulders, still controlled, but no longer untouched. Martin stepped in. "For clarity," he said, his tone, "even this account is not a personal asset. It is a probate-controlled estate account held in trust for multiple beneficiaries. Any unauthorized removal of funds is considered a serious breach regardless of the relationship between the parties involved." There it was, said out loud. Not just what happened, what it meant. Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. "I think we need to be careful about the language we're using here," he said. Calm, measured. "There's a misunderstanding about the nature of that account." I felt something in my chest go still, not fear, recognition. "This wasn't a breach," he continued. "This was a transfer involving funds that are legally tied to my spouse, which by extension involves me." A few heads turned again, uncertain, searching for clarity. That was his move, not denial, confusion. Martin didn't raise his voice. "The funds are not marital property," he said. "They are held under court supervision until distribution is complete." Daniel gave a small, almost polite smile. "That's one interpretation." The words landed wrong in the room, not aggressive, not loud, but wrong enough. Marlene shifted in her seat. "That money was for Edith's estate," she said, her voice no longer uncertain. "For all of us." Daniel didn't look at her. He looked at Martin. "And it will be accounted for," he said. "Let's not escalate this unnecessarily." Escalate. As if this hadn't already gone as far as it could. I felt the folder under my hands again, the evidence, the timestamps, the trail he hadn't fully covered. And for the first time, I realized something I hadn't fully understood before walking into that room. He wasn't trying to fix what he'd done. He was trying to redefine it. And if that worked, if even one person at that table started to doubt what the account was, everything would shift again. The room wasn't settled. It wasn't decided. Not yet. And whatever came next wasn't going to be simple. By the time I stepped out of the courthouse, the air felt different. Not lighter, not easier, just clearer. The meeting hadn't resolved anything. If anything, it had complicated everything further. Daniel hadn't denied what he did. He'd simply tried to reshape it. And for a moment in that room, I'd felt how dangerous that could be. Not because he was right, but because confusion buys time. And time in situations like this could cost everything. I stood on the courthouse steps watching people move past me, lawyers with briefcases, older couples speaking quietly, someone laughing too loudly at something that didn't matter, life continuing. Meanwhile, mine had become a set of documents, timestamps, and interpretations. My phone buzzed. A message from Martin. "We need to move quickly. Call me when you can." I didn't call right away. Instead, I walked. Down Congress Street, past storefronts, I barely noticed the cold air cutting through my coat. My mind replayed the room, every word, every pause. Daniel hadn't tried to run. He hadn't panicked. He'd leaned in. That was the mistake I almost made. Thinking this was about proving what happened. It wasn't. It was about controlling how it was understood. I stopped at the corner, my breath visible in the air. The estate account, the LLC, the resort, the marina deposit, all of it was real, verifiable. But in that room, facts alone hadn't been enough. Not yet. Because facts still needed structure. They needed to be framed in a way that couldn't be twisted. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a voicemail notification from a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated for a second before pressing play. Claire, this is Robert Klein from Mercer and Doherty. I'd like to speak with you regarding Daniel's current standing with the firm. Please return my call at your earliest convenience. I stopped walking. Mercer and Doherty? Daniel's firm, that was new. Until now, everything had been contained between me, the estate, the bank, and the family. But this meant it was spreading. Not publicly, not yet, but internally, professionally. I felt something shift again. Not the sharp break from yesterday. Something quieter, more controlled. Daniel had assumed he could move first and define the situation before anyone else caught up. But he'd made one critical miscalculation. He had tied his actions to systems bigger than both of us, the estate, the bank, and now his firm. I pulled the folder from my bag and flipped it open right there on the sidewalk, ignoring the cold biting into my fingers. The LLC registration, the timestamps, the transaction trail, and then it clicked. Not everything needed to be argued. Some things just needed to be shown to the right place. I reached into my coat pocket and took out my phone, this time calling Martin back. He answered on the second ring. Claire, he said, I was about to call you again. I think I understand what we need to do, I said. A pause. Go on. He's trying to turn this into a marital dispute, I continued. But it's not. It never was. It's an estate violation with a financial trail that leads outside the household. Yes, Martin said carefully. That's exactly the distinction we need to maintain. And the firm, I added, they're already asking questions. There was a shift in his tone. They contacted you just now. Another pause, longer this time. That changes things, he said. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I don't think we fight him in the room, I said slowly. I think we let the systems he involved do it for us. The words felt solid as they left me. Not emotional, not reactive, strategic. Martin exhaled softly. That's not a bad approach. Not a bad approach. For the first time since this started, I wasn't trying to keep up with what Daniel had done. I was starting to move ahead of it. I closed the folder and looked down the street again. The city hadn't changed, but I had. Because now I understood something he didn't. This wasn't just about what he took. It was about where he took it from. And that was something he couldn't talk his way out of. The first notice came on Monday morning. Not from Daniel, not from his attorney, from the bank. I was standing in my classroom before first period, straightening a stack of essays I had no business trying to grade, when my phone lit up with an email from Elena Lopez at Casco Bay Community Bank. Provisional recovery confirmed. Additional merchant reversals in process. I read it twice, then a third time, not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed to feel the words settle into something real. A portion of the money had already been pulled back. Not all of it, not even most of it yet, but enough to prove that the trail Daniel created could be followed both ways. That mattered. Not for my marriage. That was over in every way that counted. For the estate, for the record, for the people who had trusted me. By noon, Martin called. The court reviewed the preliminary report, he said. Your status as personal representative remains intact. I leaned back against my desk and closed my eyes. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding that fear until that moment. Not the fear of losing Daniel, not the fear of gossip, the fear of being removed, of having Aunt Edith's last act of trust taken from me because of what he'd done. There's more, Martin added. The court is treating the transfers as unauthorized pending final review. That language matters. It did. Unauthorized, not disputed, not misunderstood. Unauthorized. After school, I sat in my car in the faculty lot and called Marlene myself. I wanted you to hear it from me, I said. The court isn't treating this as a mistake on my end. On the other side of the line, she let out a breath I could almost picture. I told Diane that she said, and for what it's worth, she believes it now too. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was movement. By Tuesday, the rest of it started to turn. Robert Klein from Mercer and Dougherty called again, this time with none of the careful neutrality from his first message. He spoke like a man standing in a hallway where doors were closing. Ms. Benton, I'm calling as general counsel for the firm. Mr. Mercer has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending internal review. I said nothing. He continued anyway. The firm was not aware of Mercer Coastal Holdings LLC, nor of any transfer route involving estate-managed funds. We are preserving all relevant records. There it was. Daniel had built himself a neat little bridge out of my silence, and now every board under him was giving way. That same afternoon, his attorney sent over a revised separation filing. Gone was the language about hidden marital assets. Gone was the polite accusation that I had concealed money from the marriage. In its place was something tighter, colder, and much more careful. No one said they were backing down, but they were. By Wednesday, Elena called again. The marina released the deposit, she said. The resort reversed part of the booking after fraud review. We're still tracing the rest through the LLC account, but the recovery window is improving. I thanked her and hung up, then sat in my kitchen in complete silence, staring at the same table where this whole thing had started less than a week ago. The money was coming back in pieces, but so was the truth. Not all at once, not dramatically, through procedures, reviews, preserved records, flags and systems Daniel must have thought he could outtalk. That night he finally called, not because he wanted to explain, because he was running out of places to stand. Claire, he said, and for the first time there was no smoothness left in his voice. My firm overreacted. The bank is making this look worse than it is. I held the phone away from me for a second and looked at it like it belonged to someone else. Then I put it back to my ear. No, I said. They're making it look exactly like it is. He exhaled hard. You don't understand what this could cost me. I looked around my kitchen, at the paperwork, the unopened grocery mailer, the mug still in the sink, the ordinary life he had tried to set on fire and then call complicated. No, I said quietly. You didn't understand what it would cost anyone else. When the call ended, I didn't cry. I didn't feel relief either, just something harder, cleaner. The systems were moving now. The court, the bank, his firm, and Daniel, who had counted on private confusion, was being forced into public consequence one step at a time. He wasn't ruined yet, but he was no longer protected, and that was the first real thing that felt like justice. 5 months later, the account was closed. Not empty, settled. I stood in the small office at the probate court in Portland, signing the final distribution documents with a pen that felt heavier than it should have. Across from me, Martin reviewed the last page, then gave a small, satisfied nod. That's it, he said. Everything's been accounted for. Everything. The word lingered. Every dollar traced. Every transaction documented. Every portion of Aunt Edith's estate distributed to the people it had always belonged to. Marlene had called me the week before, her voice lighter than I'd heard it in months. Her husband's medication was covered again. The system had done what it was supposed to do, not quickly, not gently, but completely. Daniel's part had closed differently. He didn't go to trial. There had been enough evidence, bank records, the LLC, the internal review from his firm, that his attorney negotiated a plea agreement. He repaid what hadn't been recovered through reversals, including the marina deposit and the remainder of the resort charges. Mercer and Dougherty terminated him quietly, without the kind of public statement that would invite attention, but not before documenting everything internally. The story didn't make headlines, but it didn't disappear either, and for the first time, that was enough. I stepped out of the courthouse and into the early fall air, the kind that carried just a hint of cold but still held on to warmth if you stood in the sun long enough. My phone buzzed. A message from Marlene. We received the final distribution today. Thank you for not giving up on this. I read it once, then again, and slipped the phone back into my coat pocket. That had been the hardest part. Not the confrontation, not the evidence, not even the waiting. It had been choosing not to walk away when it would have been easier to let the damage settle quietly around me. I got into my car and drove toward the West End, where my new apartment sat on a quieter street lined with older buildings and narrow sidewalks. Smaller than the house Daniel and I had shared, simpler, but mine. Inside, the space was still settling into itself. A few unopened boxes, books stacked in careful piles. The kitchen table, different from the old one, sat near the window, catching the afternoon light. I placed my bag down and stood there for a moment, letting the silence feel different from before. Not empty, peaceful. On the counter, my phone lit up again. A message from Daniel. I hadn't heard from him in weeks. For a moment, I just looked at his name, then I opened it. I know I don't deserve a response. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for all of it. The words sat there small and contained. No explanations, no justifications, just a sentence. I didn't reply, not out of anger, not out of punishment, because there was nothing left to resolve. I set the phone down and walked over to the window, looking out at the quiet street below. A woman walked her dog. A man carried groceries up a set of steps. Life again in its simplest form. I had spent so much of the past months inside systems courts, banks documents, fighting to prove what was real. But standing there, I understood something that hadn't been clear before. Justice wasn't the moment everything balanced out. It was the moment I no longer needed it to. I had my name back, my responsibility completed, my life no longer tied to someone else's choices. And for the first time since that night, that was enough. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and standing up for what's right, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Sometimes the hardest decisions are the quiet ones no one else sees. If this story stayed with you, consider following along for more. There's always another chapter worth listening to.